seems to happen on a yearly basis, whether it's a rookie tight end entering the NFL or it's a savvy vet who just hasn't broken out as of yet. We hear it from a head coach. This guy's a game changer, a playmaker within our offense. He's going to be utilized dramatically differently. He's a weapon that we hear it all the time. And we're still in a position with fantasy football where if you don't own one of the top 5 guys, you're hurting at the tight end position every single week. Well, hopefully this video will help us try to figure out some guys for next year that can give us a little more stability, because the one thing that we know in fantasy football, and maybe in life in general, you need to have a tight end that can handle a load. Headliner Nation, chalk up another out-of-pocket intro for your boy. I've been on fire lately, and hopefully you've been enjoying a little bit of comedy to begin each episode. But today, I continue my volume versus efficiency series with volume monsters at the tight end position. The most difficult position in all of fantasy football right now to get consistent production from. If you got one of the top guys, typically you're okay. But if you're outside of that top 4, maybe 5, you on a weekly basis really don't know what you're going to be getting from that position. In fact, a lot of fantasy leagues have started to take out the tight end position altogether and give players an extra flex spot. Or they give the tight end position a premium scoring, meaning they get an extra half point for each reception to help make up for the fact that it is mostly a wasteland. But before we jump into all of the information today, I need to remind you that it is time to purchase your 2025 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. This thing is going to be absolutely huge this season, and it's already available. If you order it right now, you can already get into it and start digesting all of our rookie information that you could either use for dynasty and keeper leagues or just for early research for all of you redraft lovers out there. So make sure that you get your draft guide right now. There's going to be a link in the description down below. There is no draft guide in the industry that gives you more information for least money. It is the best bet that you have today in fantasy football. And I can promise you one thing, if you get it, you'll be better at fantasy moving forward. All right, let's start off with targets. And at the top of the list, rookie Brock Bowers. Now, Brock Bowers set a rookie record for most targets in a season. Malik Nabers was very close to him, but for once, we saw a tight end drafted where their coaching staff said he is going to be utilized like this, and he absolutely was. And Brock Bowers was a great asset for anyone that drafted him last season. Leads the way with 148 targets. Next to him was the breakout candidate from last year, Trey McBride. Unfortunately, he didn't score an awful lot last season, but he had a ton of volume, and he's going to be set up for another big year moving forward. Now, I think the one thing that might shock everybody out of this is the fact that Travis Kelce was third with 131 targets at the tight end position. Now, we're going to take a look at his targets and where like receptions and everything else went last season. Unfortunately, it was not the Travis Kelce that we were used to, but he is still utilized within this offense, and Patrick Mahomes finds him valuable. So how valuable should we find him for fantasy? We're going to talk about it more today. Jonnu Smith at 109 targets. This is a guy that when he was in Tennessee, we kept waiting and waiting and waiting for a breakout, and it never happened. Who knew that Miami would be the place to finally do it? I mean, they never utilized their tight end, and Jonnu Smith was absolutely one of the better tight ends in all of football last season. Good for him to finally have that breakout campaign. George Kittle, if it hadn't been for missing a couple of games, he would have been into the 100 targets with ease. One of the guys last season that outside of Brock Bowers, you could look at as being a high upside, good volume play the entire season. David Njoku at 90 targets. He unfortunately has had an issue with quarterback play. Maybe that changes this year. Even a guy like Hunter Henry, he gets a decent amount of targets, and hopefully Drake May looks his way with more opportunities for big plays this year, having Stephon Diggs and other guys to help kind of take the pressure off. those defenses crashing in on the line. Zach Ertz, Cade Otton, Dalton Schultz, Mike Gesicki, these guys right inside that top 10 area. Jake Ferguson, if he had not missed time, he would have been a lot higher. Sam Laporta missed some time, but on top of it, he had a really slow start to the season. Finally picked up towards the back half of it. So what Sam Laporta will we get in 2025? First half from 2024 or second half? Because it is a big difference. Pat Freiermuth, he could end up being a big playmaker this year. Not willing to give up on him just yet. He is one guy that, from a consistency standpoint, just have not seen it in Pittsburgh as of yet. But the possibility of being the number 2 target to DK Metcalf is absolutely there. Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, I mean, have we given up on him finally? I feel like a majority of people have. Mark Andrews was terrible to begin the year, but you're going to see here in just a second, he finished strong. Tyler Conklin, Chiggy Oko, Tucker Kraft. Tucker Kraft is a guy that fantasy owners love to argue about. I'm not a huge Tucker Kraft fan, but if you leave this guy outside your top 12 conversation, they will come for you. Either Green Bay fans or fantasy owners that absolutely love him. Juwan Johnson, great in the red zone. Maybe. We'll see here in just a minute. Noah Fant, Evan Ingram, Will Dissly, Austin Hooper, TJ Hawkinson obviously missed half the season. Some of these volume numbers would be way different next year. Isaiah Likely, Cole Kmet, Jordan Akins, Brenton Strange. Is he going to be a breakout candidate? Does Travis Hunter hurt that? And Dallas, if you're fancy, go dare. Some of these names, they're not going to matter whatsoever, but these were every single tight end last season that saw 50 or more targets. So I made the cutoff 50 targets this season. Now, are we going to talk about every single one of these tight ends moving forward? Absolutely not, because some of them, it's not going to matter. Maybe there's somebody that you get off your waiver wire, do a bye week with. Maybe they are somebody that as the season goes on, they start to see a little bit more volume. But for a majority of these guys listed, they're not going to be fantasy viable. Now, just as in the other videos, wide receivers and running backs, who did a little bit more with a little bit less? Who had a lot of volume but didn't quite do enough with it? Let's take a look at the difference between receptions and targets last season, and there is no change in the top 5. The top 5 target getters were also the top 5 in receptions last year, which was a little bit different at the wide receiver position. There were some wide receivers that had a good amount of targets, but they just fell down the boards. Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, Travis Kelce, Jonnu Smith, George Kittle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in targets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in receptions. Good to see that. Now, let's talk about some guys that had the biggest falls and maybe some guys that had the highest jumps. So the guys with the highest jumps, who had the fewest amount of targets to the most receptions, with Mike Gesicki, who had 82 targets, which was 11th, and Pat Freiermuth, who had 74 targets, which was 14th. Those guys tied for 8th in receptions at 65. So even though they got a little bit less in terms of targets, they did more with the receptions. Always love to see that. 2 of the guys that took the biggest fall, David Njoku, 90 targets, which was 6th. Cade Otton, 84 targets, which was 9th. And Dalton Schultz, who was also with 84 targets at 9th. They ended up finishing respectfully 10th, 12th, and 15th in receptions. And that's where you have to talk about catchable targets. And I was kind of alluding to some of those things in my wide receiver video, but I did get some comments about, Kyle, why are you not talking about catchable targets? Well, here's the thing. Sometimes catchable targets can be difficult to quantify because every site that consumes statistics, they look at catchable targets a little bit different. So those can be up and down across the board. So instead of just throwing in a number like catchable targets from one site and hoping that it matches, let's talk about it a little bit more and whether or not we think the quarterback position may have been an issue with some of these drops. So when you take a look at Mike Gesicki, or excuse me, not Mike Gesicki because he jumped in terms of his volume. Let's take a look at David Njoku because he dropped. He went from 6th to 10th. David Njoku in Cleveland, absolutely. Quarterback situation was a problem. Now, you got a guy like Jameis Winston who came in and absolutely ripped the ball all over the place for a while. That can be good for fantasy stance, but we also know that Jameis Winston has some accuracy issues and definitely likes to throw some interceptions from time to time. So I would say, yeah, that there may have been an issue here with catchable targets. Same thing for Cade Otton, except for the fact Baker Mayfield was really good last year. So for me personally, when I take a look at Cade Otton and maybe even Dalton Schultz, they had much better quarterback play. Now, Dalton Schultz to me isn't necessarily a byproduct of CJ Stroud, but maybe more of a byproduct of the offensive line being an issue last year. Also, when they had all of those injuries, when everybody and their mother was getting hurt, Nico Collins missed time, Stefon Diggs missed a large majority of the season after getting hurt, Tank Dell missed a large majority of the season. When those guys are banged up and Dalton Schultz becomes the number one option with not a lot of game changers around him, he might get a lot more targets, but they might not be as good because he's just the number one guy. So at that point, defenses are going to be a little bit more locked on top of him. So for me, for Dalton Schultz, he's more of a byproduct of the injuries around him and the fact that that offensive line last year was just not really good. So in our volume monster videos, we have to be really careful to not cross over that line into the world of efficiency, because when we do insane efficiency coming up over the next week or so, that is when we'll start talking about things like yards per reception. So we're going to take a look at receiving yards as of right now and take a look at the guys that saw an upward trend from targets to receptions to receiving yards, or maybe saw a downward trend. But again, I don't want to take a look at yards per reception because that's on the efficiency side and something we'll talk a lot more about in the next video. So when we jump into receiving yards, one thing we see is when we take a look at those top 5 guys once again. Top 5 in receptions against Bowers, McBride, Kelsey, Smith, and Kittle. Those 5 guys were also top 5 in receiving yards. So the top 5 guys in targets were top 5 in receptions, who were also top 5 in receiving yards. Now the receiving yards, a little bit different. So Travis Kelce was 3rd in targets and receptions. He was 5th in receiving yards. Smith, 444. George Kittle was the one that saw the bigger bump of the top 5 because he goes from 5th in targets, 5th in receptions, to 3rd in receiving yards. So 1, 2, and 4 were the same. 3 and 5 switch. And that leads to George Kittle's big play ability. He's one of the best big play tight ends in all of football. So he is a guy that you're getting a good amount of volume with, but you also know that he is going to have an opportunity for a ton of big plays. And those big plays are what lead him to having a pretty solid floor and a nice upside. And in 2025, when Brandon Ayuk may not be 100% yet, and Deebo Samuel is gone, you have to imagine that George Kittle is going to be the number 1 target in this offense. The only issue that comes up with George Kittle is the same issue with a lot of football players these days. It's injuries and it's missed time. George Kittle is a guy who has missed time over the last few years. And because of that, it does have concerns for how consistent he will be. And hopefully he doesn't miss extended time. But the one thing I will tell you is when he is on the field, there's not going to be a whole lot of options better than him in just terms of volume. But in terms of high upside play, he has the most upside of any tight end in the NFL right now. Then when you take a look at the next guys in terms of being inside the top 10 of receiving yards, Sam Laporta, he took a big jump. He was 6th in receiving yards after being 13th and 11th in targets and receptions. Tucker Kraft, I mentioned him at the beginning of the video, right? If you love Tucker Kraft, you were going to fight till the end for him. And this would be a reason why. 7th in receiving yards, over 700 receiving yards after being 20th in targets and 18th in receptions. Hunter Henry, pretty even across the board. 7, 6, 8 in receptions. Mark Andrews saw a pretty decent jump. He goes from 17th in targets, 14th in receptions, 9th in receiving yards. Mike Gesicki, pretty even. 11, 8, and 10 in receiving yards. So who are some guys that saw the biggest fall? Zach Ertz. He was a guy that was 6th in receptions. He drops to 11th in receiving yards. Pat Freiermuth, 8th in receptions. He drops to 12th in receiving yards. Now, a couple of big risers once again. Kyle Pitts. Nobody at this point likes Kyle Pitts. Comment down below if you like Kyle Pitts, and you will find yourself drafting him once again in 2025, because I'm going to do a little bit of a giveaway in this video. If this video can get 700 likes, I'm going to be giving away a draft guide to someone in the comments below that can tell me that they absolutely do love Kyle Pitts. And if you don't love Kyle Pitts, then make up a funny excuse as to why you'll be drafting Kyle Pitts once again in 2025. And if this video gets 700 likes, I'm going to pick one person from the comment section who leaves something about Kyle Pitts, likes the video, and is subscribed to give away a free draft guide. But I do have a winner from the last draft guide giveaway that I did back in my Value Monsters running back video. I set a goal of the most likes of any video this offseason, which would have put us into that 800 range. And if we got around 800 likes, I would give away a draft guide, and y'all absolutely smoked it, going over 1,000 likes. So congratulations to Brian Ferguson 1771 for winning a free draft guide after following the rules and commenting hashtag Let's Get It. Brian, you're going to be getting a free draft guide. Make sure you email us info@thefantasyheadliners.com. Use the email associated with your YouTube account that you were commenting with, and we will get you access to your draft guide right away. But good news, if you already bought a draft guide, we'll go ahead and give you a refund. So congratulations to Brian, but make sure that you get in on this giveaway as well so you can have a shot at a free draft guide. Touchdowns. Touchdowns are a reason the tight end position can be so volatile at times, because there's a lot of tight ends, unlike wide receivers, that really may not be utilized until a team gets closer to the red zone. In between the 20s, there are some big playmakers at the tight end position, but there's a few guys that really aren't utilized that much until they get closer to the 20 or even to the goal line. And that's why there's some guys who score a lot of touchdowns, but it's really hard to know on a weekly basis if they're going to score or not. There's some guys that might put up a ton of volume, but don't really see a ton of touchdowns. The difference in the tight end position and when it comes to their utilization is what makes it so difficult. And one of the things that we already discussed was how cohesive the top 5 players were at the tight end position when it came to targets, receptions, and receiving yards. Well, that changes greatly when it comes to tight ends, because of the top 5 tight ends in targets, only 2 of them were inside the top 4 in touchdowns. Now, there were 4 players tied with 7 touchdowns. So the top 4, top 5 is a little bit more expanded than what the other positions have been. But when you take a look, George Kittle, who was 5th in targets, he was second or tied for second in touchdown receptions with 8. And then right behind him was Jonnu Smith, who also had 8 touchdowns. But you got a guy like Mark Andrews, 17th in targets, 1st in receiving touchdowns among tight ends last season. And keep in mind, Mark Andrews was a guy that was widely dropped across all fantasy platforms towards the beginning of the season because of how bad he was. And he ends up scoring 11 touchdowns. Outside of that, 13th in reception, Sam Laporta, another guy that got off to a slow start, he scored 7 touchdowns. Tucker Kraft, 20th in targets, 7 receiving touchdowns. Zach Ertz was 8th in targets, 7 receiving touchdowns. And Pat Freiermuth, another guy that really speaks to what I just talked about. Maybe not utilized in between the 20s as much as we would like, but definitely a guy that sees a ton of work inside the red zone. Now, there are a few outliers here as well. Guys that saw a lot of volume but didn't really score a ton. Now, Brock Bowers was utilized all over the field. He was not a guy that had issues with targets or volume at all. He just didn't bring in as many receiving touchdowns as we would have liked, coming in with 5 last year, tying him for 9th. Travis Kelce, 3rd in targets, 3rd in receptions, 5th in receiving yards, only scored 3 touchdowns. Heck, when you take a look at a guy like Trey McBride, who was 2-2-2 across the board, Well, he only scored 2 touchdowns, so you're being consistent when you're talking about the number 2, but he needed to score more often last season, and he didn't see any touchdowns until the very end of the year. So fantasy owners all season long got a really solid floor with Trey McBride, but for whatever reason, he just wasn't scoring. Now, was he not scoring because he wasn't getting the ball? Was he not getting looked at? Why is it? Let's dive into some red zone stats now. When you take a look at tight ends in the red zone, there was one thing for certain. Guys that were targeted a lot last season were targeted everywhere, with the exception of 2 guys that fell outside the top 10 of total targets, but inside the top 10 of red zone targets. Sam Laporta being the first one, Mark Andrews being the second one. And the same thing that both of these guys have in common that I've already mentioned a couple of times in this video: slow starters. Guys that at the beginning of the season were not putting up the fantasy stats that you would have hoped. But by the end of the year, they were guys that you were playing on a pretty consistent basis, because even if they were volatile at some times and we were hoping for touchdowns when the volume wasn't there still wasn't a whole lot of guys that had higher upside than them because of their ability to score. When you take a look at Sam Laporta, 13th in targets, but he was 7th in red zone targets. Mark Andrews was 17th in targets, but he was 9th in red zone targets. So their utilization went up when they got into the red zone, making them a higher opportunity to see touchdowns and have a little bit more of an upside. The next 2 guys fall into that outlier category. Tight ends that might be utilized in between the 20s quite a bit, but then when they get into the red zone, maybe they're not the type of weapon that this offense tries to utilize. David Njoku being the first one, 90 targets last season, which was tied for 6th. Only 16 of those targets, which was 16th among tight ends, came in the red zone. For a guy that was such a big part of the offense, it was really hard for me to look at this and see, why are we not trying to utilize him more when we get closer to the end zone? Dalton Schultz, 84 targets, 9th last year among tight ends. Only 15 of those targets, tied for 17th, came within the red zone. That is an issue for both of these guys. Are they the top of tight end that isn't going to be utilized in between the 20s? Because when you take a look at the tight ends utilized in between the 20s, it gives them a solid floor. But it's when they get utilized more within the 20s, when we're looking at red zone statistics, that their upside becomes higher because there's more of an opportunity for them to score a touchdown. Now, Trey McBride and Travis Kelce were also outliers, and they were 2 of the guys that we talked about with a ton of volume but didn't score an awful lot. Trey McBride led the league in red zone targets last year with 34 and only scored 2 touchdowns, which was tied for 18th. Travis Kelce scored 3 touchdowns, which was tied for 15th, and was 2nd with 33 red zone targets. You have to think that these guys are going to see... Okay, listen, people call it positive regression, which I think is absolutely stupid. So I'm not going to call it positive regression, but I do think that we see these guys see a little bit more of a normal touchdown percentage next season. There is a lot of bad luck to be baked into the fact that you're 1 and 2 in the league in red zone targets, and you only combine for 5 receiving touchdowns. Travis Kelce should be a big part of this offense once again. And we'll talk about him at the end of the video a little bit. And for Trey McBride, you know he's going to be a big part of the offense. You were worried last season about his upside. There's no way that this guy only scores 2 touchdowns again. So the sky for Trey McBride is way higher than what it was last season. Now, when we jump to red zone receptions, the difference between targets and receptions, which we kind of talked about at the beginning of the video when we just looked at normal targets and receptions, we're going to do the same thing here. Who did the most with the least? And there's 3 guys that really pop up. And it's Pat Freiermuth, Brock Bowers, and it's Cade Otton. And really there's a difference between what we see where Pat Freiermuth was 11th in red zone targets, but he was 8th in red zone receptions, where Brock Bowers and Cade Otton saw a little bit of a step back, especially Brock Bowers, because he was 4th in red zone targets, but only 9th in red zone receptions. So that would be an area of great improvement for Brock Bowers this year. We're seeing a little bit of a difference with this offense, and maybe the run game will help with Ashton Jeanty, but you have to think to yourself, if Brock Bowers gets some of the same volume that we saw last year, you would have to think that he regresses a little bit. The amount of targets he saw last season was absolutely insane. And you have to wonder to yourself, is it going to keep up, especially with players that have been added to that offense? So if his numbers regress a little bit and the overall volume is not there, you have to hope that the red zone usage changes a little bit and he can find the end zone a little bit more, because if he can do that, then Brock Bowers is going to see a very similar ceiling to what he did last year. But if we see those touchdowns stay the same and we see those volume stats in between the 20s drop a little bit because there's more opportunities for other people now, then his floor comes down and his ceiling comes down. And you have to ask yourself, should he be drafted as the number 1 tight end? Or should I be thinking about a guy like Trey McBride or George Kittle instead? And as we talk about red zone touchdowns and move on to the final category before we look at overall score, Brock Bowers' name is going to come up again because he's one of the true outliers in this area when you look at overall touchdowns compared to red zone touchdowns, because Brock Bowers had 5 receiving touchdowns this past season, which was tied for 9th. But then when you take a look at his red zone touchdowns, he only had 3, which was tied for 13th. So that, again, leads us to believe that Brock Bowers just didn't see nearly as much success in the red zone. Why is that? Because his targets in the red zone were great. 4th in red zone targets, but the production itself was not there. Why? What is the answer to that happening? Well, the answer could be is just he was the main target and a really small portion of the field. When you have a ton of room to work with in between the 20s, you can make up for the fact that maybe you have some poor quarterback play, or maybe the fact that you just don't have enough weapons around him to really make him the focal point of the offense. When you're in between the 20s, you can do some different things like you do with Brock Bowers, where he comes from the line, in the slot, out of the backfield, all these different things that you can do with him. But then when you get inside the 20, your field gets a lot smaller. Your defense is crammed together way more, giving you less room to work with, which unfortunately is the area where Brock Bowers saw issues last season. Now, you have to hope that this year, with the threat of Ashton Jeanty, with the threat of new weapons added, with a better quarterback in Geno Smith, that if the red zone targets stay the same, that Brock Bowers will see more receiving touchdowns. But that is where the overall encompassing issue of the volatility of Brock Bowers has to be questioned when you compare him to a guy like George Kittle and when you compare him to a guy like Trey McBride. Because right now you have to believe that George Kittle and Trey McBride will be the main competition with Brock Bowers for the number 1 tight end off the board. And when you break these 3 guys down like we're going to do in just a second, I wonder if we should just lock Brock Bowers into being tight end 1. All right, here we go. Let's take a look at the final overall score. And again, we take where all of these players finished over the course of all of these categories, averaged it out. The lower the score, the better, because it means that you ranked higher consistently across the board in all of our volume stats. Now, one thing that I want to bring up that I have not talked about in this video yet, that I did talk about for wide receivers, is drops. The volume for tight ends is so much lower across the board that when you add in a category like drops to tight ends, it greatly skews the numbers, because you don't see as much volume as you do at the wide receiver position. So while I think talking about drops overall at wide receivers made a whole lot of sense, when you took a look at the final scores and what drops did to it, it greatly skewed the numbers because of the volume that tight ends see overall. So because of that, I left drops out of the equation when it came to tight ends and talked about everything else across the board though. So let's talk about the tier 1 players. George Kittle being at number 1 shocks absolutely nobody. When you look at his rankings, 5th, 3rd, 2nd, 3rd, 1st, and 2nd across the board, utilized everywhere. The other guy that I'm going to talk about, Brock Bowers. He finishes 3rd overall. When you take a look at his rankings, 1st, 9th, 4th, 9th, and 13th. Now, the other one that I just mentioned, talking about the tight end one overall, Trey McBride, he finishes in 6th place. 2nd, 18th, 1st, 3rd, 18th. So really the fall for Trey McBride was the touchdowns. The reason Brock Bowers didn't finish higher was the red zone touchdowns. And George Kittle was just fantastic across the board. So in the comments down below, I want you to let me know, as of right now, George Kittle, Trey McBride, Brock Bowers, who are you drafting as the number 1 tight end off the board? Now, if you're a late tight end type of drafter and you don't plan on taking any of these guys because you don't love where their ADP is at, that's fine. But just think about this. In a world where you are going to be taking a tight end early, which one of these guys do you feel the most comfortable going with? How about Jonnu Smith, finishing number 2, 3.57, his average finish? This is a guy that I hope can keep it up going into next year. I do have some concerns about him moving forward with this type of volume, and I really hope that his ADP does not get too high. Travis Kelce is going to be a guy that I'll invest in. As a late round tight end drafter, there's a good chance that Travis Kelce is going to be invested as a top 10 tight end, but back towards the bottom part of that order. So a guy that might finish 8, 9, or 10 is where his ADP will be. He's not going to be drafted in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round, whatever it used to be. So if you're waiting on tight end based on the volume alone, even when we take a look at efficiency, if it's not that good for Travis Kelce, he could still give you a potential decent floor every single week, especially if there's going to be more healthy options around him. So even if the volume falls a little bit, maybe the efficiency does get better. Zach Ertz is a free agent right now, so we're not going to talk about him too much. Trey McBride, Sam Laporta, and Mark Andrews. For as difficult as it was to start the year with these guys, they finished very strong. Sam Laporta should be a big part of this offense once again, but it really is going to come down to whether or not Jameson Williams sees more consistent volume. Jameson Williams is still a boom or bust type of player. He's going to have some big games. He's going to have some games where he doesn't quite give you everything that you need. Sam Laporta should be the number 3 target in this offense, especially if Jahmyr Gibbs sees an uptick in carries. You got to wonder if he's going to see as many targets and receptions as what we did this past year, giving Sam Laporta an opportunity for some of those. But Sam Laporta's red zone usage may be where we have to go from now on, the same as Mark Andrews. These are a couple of guys that are not going to have a great floor. And we can include Pat Freiermuth in that as well, who ranks right behind him. Because these are the 3 big outliers here. Because these guys finished 13th, 17th, and 14th in targets, 11th, 14th, and 8th in receptions, 6, 9, and 12 in receiving yards. But they finished within the top tier because of their usage within the red zone and their touchdown ability. So these are 3 guys that maybe they don't give you the best floor in the world because they're not going to see consistent volume in between the 20s, but they're going to have really solid upside every single week because of how they are utilized in the red zone and their touchdown potential. Pat Freiermuth of this group right here, I think, has the best opportunity to jump the highest. But a lot of it is going to depend on who the quarterback actually ends up being for Pittsburgh. All right, what about tier 2 players? What do we see as the 2025 outlook for some of these guys? Cade Otton, there's no way that he is going to sustain this type of usage. He might be the biggest faller in these numbers when we take a look at these again in 2026 because of just the plethora of weapons that they have around them, drafting Emeka Egbuka, and then also potentially having Chris Godwin back as well. Cade Otton probably is going to fall, and at this point, for me personally, is undraftable at the tight end position. Tucker Kraft is a guy that you're going to have to hope for touchdowns and big plays. And that was kind of the name of the game last season for him. But now that they've added Matthew Golden, you got to wonder is Tucker Kraft going to be the number 2 option? Will he be the number 4 option? Will he be the number 6 option? Because it's Matthew Golden, and then there's several wide receiver 2-3 type players behind him that you could really argue that Tucker Kraft could lose targets to or could have more targets than. Really, he's going to need to score touchdowns. Hunter Henry is a guy that, yes, you've added Stefon Diggs, but maybe you can take a step forward after another year with Drake May. Drake May looked to Hunter Henry a lot last season. My hope is that volume stays about the same, even if the touchdowns are not there. David Njoku, one of the most interesting ones because you really don't have receiving weapons that were added for the Cleveland Browns. Now, the thought was they would draft Travis Hunter, but they didn't. They moved back in the draft, so adding Travis Hunter to the wide receiver mix isn't going to hurt David Njoku. David Njoku is really going to be dependent on the quarterback position, and there's really 4 of them right now that could end up working out. Kenny Pickett definitely could end up being one of them that comes in, plays well, ends up being the starter the rest of the way. Obviously, you're going to have Joe Flacco there that's going to be competing for a job. But then you have the rookies, Dillon Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders, that one of those guys, maybe they see time at some point this season. So if they have a revolving door at quarterback, that could end up hurting David Njoku. Mike Gesicki, he re-signs with Cincinnati, but so does T. Higgins. So is Mike Gesicki going to end up seeing the same type of work that he saw last season, especially if T. Higgins is healthy and on the field all year? And then Dalton Schultz, the quarterback position. Can CJ Stroud get back to the way he was as a rookie instead of that downfall we saw last season? But the offensive line is going to play a huge part. The Houston Texans have also added several young wide receivers. All right, so for these last 2 tiers, I'm going to go a little bit quicker with them and really just try to pinpoint whether or not I think each tight end could be better moving forward for the next year. Kyle Pitts, I've got no interest in him. I don't care about him. I don't care if he finishes as the tight end 1 this year. Not willing to risk it with him once again. Volume's bad. Efficiency's bad. He just doesn't get the job done. Isaiah Likely, Mark Andrews is not going anywhere. Isaiah Likely is going to have 3 huge games a season. Everyone's going to panic over it, and they're going to make poor choices. Tyler Conklin, he's got a new team, the Los Angeles Chargers, who love to utilize the tight end position. But they also have a few younger guys there as well that could end up seeing more time than him. Really depends on if he's the starter or not, but if he does start, he could be a guy that I definitely could see going higher. Juwan Johnson is going to continue to be a red zone threat. He is the guy that I'm looking at for scoring touchdowns. Not a safe floor, but potentially a high ceiling. Cole Kmet, with Colston Loveland being there in Chicago, with Rome Odunze and DJ Moore, I want no part of Cole Kmet this year. Austin Hooper with the New England Patriots, he's going to be behind Hunter Henry, so not really looking at Austin Hooper all that much. Dalton Kincaid is very close to being the next Kyle Pitts. A guy coming out that was supposed to be this weapon that could be utilized all over the field and has not paid off since then. Dalton Kincaid is going into what I believe to be a make or break year. Can the volume get better? Absolutely. But will it get better is a huge, huge question mark. Here at the bottom tier, I'm only going to talk about a couple of names that obviously will see a bump up in overall volume this year. Jake Ferguson. He was hurt last season, and even though they added George Pickens, if he can stay healthy, even as the number 3 option on this team, he could see way more volume than he did last year, and with Pickens drawing players down the field and CeeDee Lamb being the primary target, he could see a fair amount of big plays to go with that. Taking a look at Brenton Strange, no more Evan Ingram, who's right behind him on this list. Travis Hunter was added, which really could hurt Brenton Strange, but we know T-Law looked to Strange when Ingram was hurt last year. Evan Ingram, he's going to be in an offense that wants to utilize the tight end position way more often out in Denver. Can he see the targets? He is a guy, if he stays healthy, should see a big bump. And TJ Hockenson, same thing. Will he be the number 2 target behind Justin Jefferson, or will he be the number 3 target behind JJ and Jordan Addison? Whatever ends up happening with him, he should still see a big bump, giving us a full healthy season. Headliner Nation, there's the tight end position. A lot of tight ends that we talked about today, a ton of information that we dove into, and hopefully these videos are helping you starting to piece together some strategies that you want to develop for drafting this season. If you appreciate the content, make sure you hit the like button on the way out, so not only do we know you like the content, but you're going to have an opportunity to win a free draft guide. Leave a comment down below and make sure you are subscribed to the channel if you are new here, and everybody should have the bell notifications on, so anytime we go live or drop new content, you'll know about it right away. Headliner Nation, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.